Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us again. Today, I've got Bryan Marble from ClientRock with us. Bryan, if you want to go ahead and introduce yourself to everyone, that'd be great.
Sure. Like you said, I'm Bryan Marble. I'm from ClientRock. We started a few years ago as mostly a automated intake product, but we found folks really enjoyed the online scheduling aspect of things. So that's what we're focusing on today is being a online consultation booking platform for attorneys.
Got it. Okay, so I lots of thoughts. So I would love to dive into kind of the iteration. I mean, you've had multiple company names, and this is great because for a couple of things. One is kind of understanding the evolution of your product, and we're going to get into the very like practical aspect of how uh, legal professionals will use ClientRock. But I'd love to hear kind of like you said, you've gone through iterations. I'd love to hear about that and kind of what prompted that, because it's really, I think it's interesting for everyone, especially when, maybe later on we could talk a little bit about, the past year and how your company has even evolved since then because of, COVID and that fun topic. But people really like to hear like how products evolve and what caused that. So like maybe take us back to the beginning and tell us about how you got started.
Sure. Yeah, I'll actually start a little bit before that. So I used to run a product called Amaze Law, which was basically a marketing platform for attorneys. And at one point, I asked my customers, "Oh, what could I build for you? What would you want now that you have folks coming to your website?" And everybody said, I'd like to be able to collect information from them. I'd like to be able to qualify these leads that are coming through. Basically, intake forms is what everyone told me, is that once they go from the website, they want to have some sort of standard intake process. um, and I had been working at that point for a couple of years in the lawyer website space. And for anyone that's ever transitioned a website, it's a very involved process. So um, going from somebody's existing Squarespace site to another and moving it to another platform, there's a lot of forms that have to be filled out. There's a lot of steps to that process, and I had automated all of it so that I could manage it all on my own mostly. And so I decided to take that approach to legal intake. And so it was a very prescriptive. um, Somebody comes in, they fill out a form, they sign a fee agreement, and then they become a client. um, that worked really well for a good amount of time. But what we found is that it was really because it was so opinionated about how lawyers do intake.
Right.
I think this is one of the bets I made, and I would say it was the incorrect bet, was that folks would give up the ability to customize everything in favor of a very opinionated way of doing things that simplified it.
Interesting.
Um, but that's not everyone's business is just a little bit different, and everybody has developed a way of operating their business. And who am I to come in and tell you how to operate your business, which is what I found. So at that point, I restarted on ClientRock to make it much more flexible. So, if you do a payment before a form, and then after the form, you do a meeting, and then you do another payment, we can do that. We could do all of that. And so we ended up building out a pretty powerful client portal experience, which still exists and we still support and will continue to improve. But the basis for all of that was this initial consultation that people were having. And so we started pushing on that as kind of a really high leverage point the for the attorney client relationship, basically. So you want folks to be able to come in, meet with you, stop their search when they're looking for an attorney, and really get started. And so we decided to really hone in and focus on that experience and making sure that that just one just works, but is as convenient as possible for the attorney, for the client, and really gets that relationship off on the right foot.
Got it. So it's interesting, like when you're talking about this bet that you made on customization versus not. And that's a facet. I mean, that could be like a whole other discussion, but it's real interesting because you're right. Like law firms tend to believe that they've got kind of the magic intake. Well, I guess there's the spectrum. don't pay attention to it all, and they recognize they don't pay attention to it all, to the I've got a magic solution. And oftentimes even the people that believe they've got it figured out aren't actually tracking data related to it, and so they don't know if it's working or not. If you say, well, how many leads you get? I don't know. I think we have on a spreadsheet somewhere. Cool. Well, what's your conversion rate look like? Oh, we have no idea what that is. So it feels good to them, that they've built something. But at the end of the day, you don't know if it's working or not. It may be, but you just don't know.
Yeah, I mean, most firms start out, like if you think about a typical solo, you're doing, some folks are just taking whatever comes in the door,
Right.
and you're doing it at a volume that it doesn't matter whether you're efficient. So you end up building up a process over time, and you just end up solidifying and calcifying what you've always done, but it wasn't built from the beginning to be a scalable,
Right.
systemizable way of doing work. And so you end up, by the time you get to the point where that's painful, which is when people are start looking at like intake software, it's like, I need something to manage this process for me. But by that point, you're already so calcified in the way that you've done things that it either requires, a practice management consultant to come in and tell you and teach you how to do the intake in a more
Right.
systemizable way, or you just have to give up and build your own that matches exactly what you have. And both of those things are really hard. Especially when you're already sitting there, stressed out by the fact that you have all of these leads coming through. Some of them are dropping off. It's hard to take a step back and reformat that process.
Absolutely. And I'm thinking of a couple of clients in particular, but where they have a special color piece of paper that are for leads. It's like the blue sheet or green sheet, and we've implemented software for them, and they're still, we get into it like, all right, so where, how's it going? You're using all this, and then like, well, yeah, well, I mean, we still use the piece of paper first, and then we're duplicating it in the software. It's like, well, but why? It's like, well, it just feels right. Okay, so yeah, the behavior. We're all talking about kind of behavior change type issues, which are tough, especially when it comes to intake, because it's such a sensitive area. Because if you get it right, then that's the ball game as far as being able to run a solid law firm. Is if you can get the work in the door. Most lawyers are good with the actual like execution of the work. That's what we're trained for, but then it's getting it in and getting it effectively in the door first.
Yeah.
So let's talk about scheduler. So obviously lots of competitors out there that are non-legal specific. So you're a legal market specific scheduler, right?
Right, exactly. So there's you can look up all of the different schedulers that are out there. A lot of folks use Calendly or Acuity, which are great if you don't need to accept payments, if you don't need any sort of complicated intake. But the second you start taking payments, you realize you can't do it through a trust compliant way. So if you wanted to, the folks that come to us, they've been charging for consultations. Someone will book through Calendly, and then their assistant has to go and email the client the law pay link, and then trust that the person gets there to make that payment, and then check every day until the actual appointment happens. Then they get to the day of the appointment and it hasn't been paid, and what do you do now? Do you cancel the meeting? Do you ask them to reschedule? Do you eat the cost? Most times you just eat the cost, and it just becomes this really terrible headache when all it should be is the person entering their payment details when they book, which is what we allow folks to do.
So is it set up? So maybe let's back up a little bit as far as if I am a potential customer of yours, I want to get into scheduler. Say I've used Calendly, but I want to go legal specific. Like what's the onboarding process look like? Is it a difficult process? What's that all look like?
No, it's dead simple. I mean, we have a free 7-day trial. There's no credit card up front or anything. You sign in, connect your calendar to it. You can connect your personal calendar and your work calendar so that you can kind of use them both to figure out your availability. And then from there, we already have a few meeting types set up for you already if you want to just use those, or you can create as many meeting types as you want. Right from the get-go, you have a booking page that you can go in and have folks book to your calendar to. It takes literally less than 30 seconds.
Got it. So easy onboarding. You mentioned like, syncing your personal calendar too. So when, I mean, my scheduling tool, as you know, is X.ai, which is a, um, industry agnostic body type scheduler that I've used for probably 5 years or so since it was in beta. I use it for everything, and so is, something like, compared to a case management software scheduling tool, is this something that is kind of honed in on a specific aspect of the life of a client, or is it something intended to use broader, like a X.ai or a Calendly?
We can do both. So it doesn't have to just be consultations. That's where we find we provide the most value, because there is such a, again, it's a really high leverage point in that relationship. But let's say it's great for scheduling client consultations. So typically you wouldn't pay for those. Some folks have even gone as far as creating an entire practice around just paid consultations. So if you want to charge, $500 for a 1 or 2 hour consultation, and that is the engagement, it's nothing
Right.
more than that. And like folks can just come in and book time with you, and the entire practice runs off of that. It can be really streamlined. So there's a lot of different options there, but you can use it for legal stuff. You could use it for non-legal stuff. You could have it for like networking meetings with folks, or just setting up coffee dates with, colleagues. It doesn't have to be consultations, but that's where we find it's most valuable.
Do you, I mean, as a software company, we get into the conversation all the time about, with our clients, whether it's intake clients or otherwise, about the whole charging for consultations. Some have done it for years and, live and breathe by it. Like you said, that's just part of how you do it. And, they experiment with different pricing models, and when, times are tough, and, for example, like last March, April 2020, when there weren't a ton of calls, drop the consultation fee, $99 versus 300, or free, or whatever it is, to make sure the phone rings and people come in. Do you get into those kind of conversations with your customers, as far as like, well, do we charge a consultation fee? How should we do it? Does that come up in the life cycle of your engagements?
Yeah, it's a very kind of personal choice, but I would always err on the side of charging, for a number of different reasons. And it varies heavily depending on your practice area, where you're talking really high volume and it's a qualification game, like in PI, maybe you don't charge for consultations. But if you're dealing with somebody, uh, whether it's family law or anything, especially consumer facing, I would always have, even if it's just a nominal fee of like $20, just to prevent somebody from being a tire kicker and just using that call in order to, sap your knowledge. I know some folks who kind of want to wade into it. They start with, take my hourly rate for whatever the meeting is. At the end of it, if you decide to hire me, we'll deduct that from the cost of your retainer going forward. And that's another way to do it. The one thing I'd say there is be careful about trust accounting rules, whether somebody considers that payment for legal services or not. But in any case, there are ways to go around this. But the point is, if somebody isn't willing to spend $150 to get a good sense of, their legal matter and what they need going forward, they're probably not going to spend thousands of dollars hiring you either. So that time you spend, onboarding that client, even for that little bit, can end up being wasted.
Right. No, absolutely. I noticed on your site, you've got several integrations out there, including with like virtual receptionists like Smith.ai. Can you talk about how that workflow exists between the Smith, handling your leads, processing your leads, or Smith or whatever virtual assistant service, whether it's chat or phone, or how does that all fit together with your scheduler?
Yeah, I mean, not everyone is going to find your scheduling link. We often tell people, put it in your email signature, put it on your LinkedIn profile, obviously link to it from your website. But some folks just want to have a phone call. And so they end up calling your office, and the Smith or whatever virtual receptionist you use, the receptionist can take all of that information over the phone and basically go through the process as if somebody was going through it on your scheduler. They can take the payments over the phone. They can take all of the intake information that you want. It's really straightforward for them, and it allows you to meet the client wherever they are. If they're really comfortable on the phone, the receptionist can handle it, and it all ends up going through one system. And then, especially when it comes in through ClientRock, through our Zapier integration, you can have that data go wherever you need it to. If you want to have that go into a CRM, we can do that. If you want it to go into your case management system, you can do that too. But you want to kind of funnel that data through one point so that you can get everybody onto a standardized process.
Got it. Let's talk about Zapier just for a second, because this is one of those topics where most people have heard about Zapier, but there's often confusion around what it is and what it doesn't do. So the way I describe it, I don't know if you agree with this, but like Zapier is kind of this third-party connector where if you have different cloud-based solutions, it allows you to push data between them that you otherwise wouldn't be able to do, and be pretty creative with how you do it, and it creates a lot of flexibility. Is that a fair way to describe it?
Yeah, it's like having a standardized pipe between all of the different software you use. And if there's one thing that I've learned over the years, it's that everybody has a slightly different set of software tools that they use and like and prefer. And Zapier just makes connecting all of those much easier. They have a free plan, so it's not like you have to go in and pay for yet another thing. It's pretty straightforward to get started with. Um, but again, it's probably the gateway drug to automating all of your practice. So
Right.
I would definitely give it a try, even if it's just as simple as, when somebody books a meeting, add their name to a spreadsheet that I can then use as a conflict check later on. It's
Right.
really simple to set something like that up, and takes 5 minutes.
Yeah, no, I think use it for lots of different things, and yeah, it creates those little, I mean, some people use it for automation that just saves hours and hours and hours a week, and I have
Mhm.
found that it is really good for just kind of like not at most, but at the least, like helping you to not duplicate data entry of information. Put it
Right.
in once and then allow that to kind of spread everywhere else.
Right. So especially if you're looking at your initial consultation as sort of like that first step, that like that start point for your entire relationship with the client, then you can send that data into your email marketing suite or your marketing automation tool or your case management software, all of those places, so that you have all of that data synced together. That way you're not relying on an assistant to go, okay, this person booked a call, I'm going to copy their information out of the calendar into the case management software. Maybe I misspell somebody's name, and then you end up with all sorts of other issues. So just being able to standardize that is really key.
Yep, absolutely. So we're having this conversation kind of near the end of April 2021. Depending upon your particular news source, the pandemic may or may not be over and or coming to an end. Pick your favorite commentary. What I mean, obviously, scheduler, like you've evolved your business model over the past year. Like how have things been going? What have you seen, from internally, and including from like a customer base over the past year, that the kind of forced and now more voluntary work for home methodologies have evolved?
Definitely more folks are more comfortable doing virtual consultations. Whereas before we would have folks maybe 50-50 would do
Right.
in person versus Zoom calls. Now it's almost entirely online. And we're actually just starting to see that shift back into in person. But with ClientRock, you can choose, you can manage either one, let the client choose. But it's the one thing I'll say is, whereas before a lot of folks relied on, that client coming into the office with a signed paper check with a printed out PDF with all of their information on it. Like that stuff just isn't necessary anymore. There are tools that can make that process a lot simpler, increase the chances that somebody is coming into that initial consultation with the information you actually need and can use to figure out whether they're a good fit client for you. So I think it's forcing everybody to at least start thinking about how do we do this in a world where I can't rely on somebody dropping something off at my office, for example.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. It's gonna be interesting just kind of how we continue to see, and I feel like I'm seeing, at least outside the legal industry, about 3 new articles a day or more, like on what work from home or hybrid work looks like going forward. So yeah, continuing to use tools that enable both is just going to be necessary going forward. And so you're right, like that. I mean, a lot of firms had pre-COVID, or even as COVID started, they would, disperse to work from home and realize the only way they could process credit cards was with the machine in the office. So what do we do now? Like, so things like that, maybe for some of us seem obvious and have had it in place for years. With things like law pay, for example, it wasn't obvious to everyone. So making sure that you still have that set up going forward, even if you are, going back to work, go back to the office, it's necessary to keep it there. Well, Bryan, listen. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I don't think, regardless of when COVID kind of peaks and goes away or comes back, I don't think we're ever going back to a world where everybody wants to meet in person. There,
Right.
I think these tools have to exist, or at least have to coexist with a virtual option for folks. So I think the idea that you can kind of wait and just wait till COVID's over and it'll go back and we'll be able to run our credit cards on our machine and everyone will come into the office again. I think that's going to leave a lot of people out because I don't think I don't think this we're going back to that world pre-COVID.
Right. Agreed. Well, Bryan, I really appreciate you taking the time today. Folks want to get in contact or get signed up for ClientRock, what's the best way to do that?
Sure. You can head over to clientrock.com. Again, we have a free 7-day trial. You can try it out, see how it works for you. We're at ClientRock on Twitter, and anytime you want to get in touch, it's Bryan, Bryan at clientrock.com. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Bryan. Appreciate it.
Awesome. Thanks, Chad.